first and foremost for me that I think about as I head into an upgrade project is to make sure that you have a project plan. And it should be a very detailed project plan. At least for me, in my experience, the more detailed and the more steps that you have, the better. The other thing that I would tell you about starting your upgrade is typically you have a date in which you're wanting to go live by, and you try to back into that date. And I know that that is oftentimes just the way things really, the way things work. But what I would tell you is that it is good to look at all of the tasks that you have and to try to base that date based on the amount of work that you have ahead of you. And so there's things that we'll be talking about throughout this presentation that, after you put your 2012 code through the code upgrade tool in LCS, that'll give you a good idea of the amount of work ahead of you, which will help you as you try to figure out what that plan is. The other thing that I will tell you is that you should plan to have buffer in that project plan. And how much buffer you have really depends on the size of your project. So I would say any project should have at least 1 week of buffer for something to go wrong. I was thinking about it this morning, actually. I was like, I don't know if I've had any major version upgrades where there wasn't something unexpected that came up or some issue that we ran into that we had to work through. And so I always recommend that you have at least 1 week of buffer for that, something to go wrong. If it's a larger project, if you have a lot of code to be upgrading or you have a lot of ISVs, you will need more than 1 week of buffer because there are going to be unexpected things that come up. So make sure you get that in your plan. Also, before you start the upgrade, you want to make sure that if you have any ISVs, that you've reached out to them and that you have gotten their code. There are a few steps that you can do without their code, but in order to proceed with a code upgrade, you need their D365 version of the code. And that means you need to have decided which version you're going to go with and get that code from them. So I often tell people start early because sometimes it takes you longer than you think it should to get that code from your ISVs. Another part is to evaluate your customizations and eliminate things that are no longer needed. And when you go through what's called the upgrade analyzer, which is a tool that Microsoft has, one of the things that it helps you with is looking at like what are some of the deprecated features, and you can also look at what areas am I using, do I need to continue using those areas. And the last thing that I would say here from this slide is to implement a code freeze on your current version. And you don't actually have to, before you get started, you don't have to have that code freeze. But what we want to make sure is that people understand that it really is ideal if you do a code freeze, meaning we're not pushing any more code into 2012. And David and I both understand what that means, and that there's a lot of pushback on that particular item. But David, probably more than me, even can tell you the problems that you can run into when you start adding code into your 2012 when you've already started the code upgrade, especially if you're going to make new objects or change tables because of IDs. It can be very complicated and cause us some issues. So it is best, if possible, to set a code freeze date and then stick with that. All right, David, next slide. All right, some other things before you start your upgrade. The first is in LCS, you'll want to create a new project. If you haven't worked with LCS, I guess we all just call it LCS, but that stands for Life Cycle Services, which is something on 2012 you had available to you. I'm not sure how many of you would have used it extensively, but in the D365 world, that is a place that you will be quite often, especially if you're on the technical side. That's where we do a lot of the managing of the implementation and of the code and how it's deployed. So you'll want to go into LCS and create a new project. And you'll actually have two projects during the phase, LCS projects during your implementation, but there's a first one that really is focused on the upgrade and the tools that you need for the upgrade portion. And then there's another project that you'll create for the actual implementation. But this Dynamics AX, in this screenshot, I went in and I created a project. I gave it a name. The name doesn't really matter. You can call it whatever you want there. The product would be finance and operations. And then you can pick an industry, but really the most important part is that methodology, which is upgrade Dynamics AX 2012 to Dynamics 365 for finance and operations preview. Someday it might have the preview come off, but for right now it still has that preview name on it. And that's what you want to select in there. Some other things as you create that project is this is going to be what's called an LCS project. The other thing that you'll be creating is a Visual Studio project, and you'll have to tie your Visual Studio project, or I'm supposed to call it Azure DevOps. You'll create your Azure DevOps project and you'll tie it to LCS. And one of the things that I would also say as you start your upgrade is if you are not familiar with Azure DevOps, I know a lot of our clients use TFS, which was the predecessor to what then became VSTS, which is now Azure DevOps. We use a lot of the features of Azure DevOps in the D365 version of Dynamics, and getting yourself familiar with pipelines and the builds and all of the features within that product are going to be very helpful for you, because we're going to be doing things like branching and doing code merges within Azure DevOps. So if you do not have experience in that, that's an area that doing some learning would be beneficial for you. David, if you move to the next slide, there's this optional step, and I would say, well, the second part really isn't optional. The first part is the 2012 upgrade analyzer. And what that does is it goes through and it helps you evaluate what are some areas where I can do data cleanup. And part of the reason for that is you're going to be taking your database and you're going to be uploading it to Azure and then restoring it into the environment. And so that process, depending on how big your database is, could be lengthy. And so we want to try to get those your database to as small of a size as we can, so that we decrease the amount of time that it would take to upload that database and then to restore that data into the environment. And in the data cleanup, there are things that if you're my client, you probably have already heard, or if you've been to other presentations where I talk about sysadmin, there's really some basic things that you can do, such as cleaning up your batch history and your AIF document log if you're using services. But there's other data cleanup related to actual, transactional type data that you might want to look at as you go to move. from 2012 to D365. There's some things that it'll look at as far as your SQL configuration to make sure that SQL is set up optimally. And then it will also look at what deprecated features you're using so that you can plan for how would I accommodate for those features as I move to the next version. And then the other part that isn't optional is in Dynamics AX 2012, you actually have to get one of these two KBs and apply that in your 2012 system, because there is what's called a pre-upgrade checklist, and there's some items that you have to do on that checklist. Some have to do with setting up and specifying what your Azure tenant or what your tenant is, so that as we're copying the database and doing some steps during the upgrade, you have the necessary data in your database for the upgrade.